Hello and welcome to the 1895 podcast with me, Thomas D.
And me, Rob Cockerell.
And Rob, we've reached the halfway mark of the year, as we referenced last week. We're heading into Q3 now, just coming up the back of that Spec Gas triple header. How did you find listening back to all of those?
Oh, fantastic. It feels like you're back in the room now, doesn't it, when you listen to some of those clips?
It's great, and great to revisit some of those big talking points in Spec Gas, which we don't often get to cover, especially here on the 1895 podcast.
Yeah, I've said it before, Tom. I'll say it again. I don't think we cover Spec Gas quite enough. So it was great to dive into that at the event and then the triple header on the playback. But interesting as well, the link with today's episode. We talked a lot about specialty gases, back to basics, back to the core. We're going to do a bit of that today, I think, aren't we?
And back to the core team as well, I suppose, if you could call it that.
Absolutely.
Because as promised last week, we are halfway through the year, so it's great to be able to get all of our editors in on this call and perhaps review the first half of the year and have a few predictions for what's next.
A veritable hit squad of journalists, editors, analysts.
Yes, and we are joined by Christian Annesley, our global managing editor, Molly Burgess, our US editor, and Charlie Curry, our H2 View editor. Thanks to all three of you for joining us today. Christian, I guess I'll come to you first, but how would you reflect upon the first half of 2025?
Yeah, I don't want to steal all of Charlie's thunder, but obviously hydrogen has been centre stage in many respects. Which Charlie and Molly will both talk about at length, essentially, because lots of different dynamics there. I'll touch on them at this point, then we can delve into the detail later on. But hydrogen policy in the US has faced uncertainty for the whole period, and in many respects, it's not looking good now. At the same time, a lot of the persistent challenges that have been in the industry have continued. So, none of that is a surprise, but we haven't had any big change of course in the first half. So I'll leave it there for now, and the others can pick up on that later on. I suppose some of that was brought to a head by what happened with Air Products this year. One of the crucial industrial gas majors, and they've obviously had a change of leadership early in the year in February. The new team came in to review everything, and again, green hydrogen, their big green hydrogen projects were in the spotlight from early on. What we found out in May, when the new CEO came and spoke for the first time on an earnings call, was that core projects, so some of those core green hydrogen projects were being canned. They had a $3 billion write-down to talk about. A whole load of other projects are being rethought, trying to de-risk those projects, and a big commitment to going back to basics, essentially, from here on, funding your projects in a less speculative way, getting deals up front before you proceed, all that kind of thing. Again, we can go into it in a bit more depth later on, but that really kind of brought things to a head and illustrated some of the problems that hydrogen faces.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. And we actually did cover that Air Products story in quite some depth earlier this year on a podcast, wasn't it? Episode 48. Great to go into some of that detail there. And one of our most popular
I was just going to say one of our most popular. And speaking of depth, you dove straight in there with Christian, didn't you? No small talk, Tom, straight into business.
Yeah, I won't say what I was going to say there. Charlie, that's teed you up quite nicely there, I think, on the hydrogen point of view. I'll come to you now. How would you reflect on the first half of 2025?
Yeah, I think I kind of follow suit on the US side of things. Sorry, Molly. It's kept me quite busy. It's kept us all quite busy. I think for those of you who haven't been following it, as part of President Trump's big, beautiful bill, essentially his budget for the next year, a massive rollback in the 45V hydrogen tax credit was included. Which would have seen it end at the end of this year, meaning only projects that start construction before then could have received the incentive. To be quite blunt, had that gone ahead, it would have been catastrophic. From speaking with a few trade associations, I think the view was that very few projects would have been able to accelerate to meet that timeline. It would have only been those that had taken a gamble back in 23, 24 maybe. However, the adopted rollback is not as bad. It's being praised by a lot of people as quite a good concession. So now the tax credit's going to be ending in 2027. But I think we are seeing a little bit of a split. While publicly people are saying this is a really positive thing, it's still 5 years early. This tax credit was due to be ending in 2033. And based on the poll that we had on H2View the day after, I think it's a pretty clear split. Some people say projects are going to accelerate to meet the deadline, while others are kind of thinking that a lot of the early stage projects will face the axe. And I think the reason for that, as I mentioned, so many projects would have had to have taken a gamble the past couple of years to have met the originally proposed cutoff. But given the uncertainty that has been going on with 45E, even under the Biden administration, this whole debate around the rules for how green it's going to be, and then once we had President Trump elected, I don't think anyone would have really been in the gambling mood, to be quite blunt. So, yeah, it's a tentative outlook in the US at the moment. I think we are going to see some of those bigger projects where there's already been a lot of investment thrown into it. They might start to come to fruition, but some of them on the outsides there, I'm not sure, and I would include the hydrogen hubs in that. Remember, they've only had the first tranche of funding. I think between seven of them, it's less than 200 million out of the 8 billion they're supposed to have received. And then we also have the DOE reviewing all of those. So it's going to be an interesting time. But then more broadly, I think this has really been a year of... it's been brutal, to be honest. We're seeing companies really consolidating, especially on the electrolyzer side of things. They were kind of given goals by policymakers a few years ago that we need this much. They've scaled up, they've invested, and now there's no demand. That kind of, the glass seems to have shattered on the price of low carbon hydrogen, or especially green hydrogen. You know, all of these goals, we're going to get to $1 a kilogram by 2030. I think there's a real acceptance that isn't going to be the case. So yeah, we'll dive into a few other bits later on, but it's been an interesting time to be covering this.
Thanks, Charlie. Well, the hydrogen bubble burst 6 months ago and the glass has shattered halfway through this year, so I wonder what's next.
Yeah, I think Charlie needs to get some tissues there as well and take a deep breath. It's all right. It's going to be all right, Charlie.
Well, Charlie, if it's been a busy first half of the year for you, Molly, for listeners unfamiliar, you're our, I say newly appointed US editor, 6 months into the job now. A lot of the stories we've just heard about from Christian and Charlie have been US based, so no doubt a busy start to the year for you too.
No, yeah, certainly. I was going through our top stories earlier today, and the majority of them are from the US. I think there's so many factors that have resulted in that. Obviously, Charlie and Christian have alluded to hydrogen policy, but I want to share some good news that's come out of policy just this week, actually. So the Section 45Q tax credit for CO2 utilisation versus sequestration has now been equalised. So that is a huge win for the CO2 industry. CO2 sequestration was favoured with the tax credit previously, which was huge talking points at our events and among, the companies that we work with, especially with concerns that the merchant market is quite, risky anyway. So that really gives that incentive for companies to make sure CO2 they're producing is utilised and not just put in the ground. So that's a huge win for them. That's something that the CGA with the CO2 Solutions Coalition has been fighting for a long time. We've heard, over the past year or so that there's been that real fight for to educate policymakers. So yeah, that's a huge win from the CO2 front. So it's great to see some positives coming out of US policy this year as well.
Yeah, that is a real win there, Molly. We heard a lot about that in Nashville last year at our CO2 summit. We know that coalition's been banging on that door, so a huge result. And I was glad to hear you bring up CO2 because that was going to be one of my questions for the editors later on. So maybe we'll dive into that a little bit later, Tom.
Yeah, we'll save that one. But for now, Molly, I want to stick with you. And as someone who's taken over the reins as US editor, we've heard so much about hydrogen policy. You've told us there a little about CO2 policy. Of course, we're 6 months into this second Trump presidency now. So what else has been going on in the US policy-wise?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot, obviously with the big, beautiful bill as well. The semiconductor market has been impacted that, but again, positively, that tax credit has been, increased to 35% now, I think it is, from 25% as an incentive to, start building new fabs. That's all part of Trump's goal to onshore these supply chains. So that's another positive thing to come out of US policy this year. Again, that was only last week. So I think, we're going into the second half of the year getting these solid answers and knowing, some solid paths forward where maybe not with everything, but with some things. Obviously, tariffs have been an ongoing thing throughout the year. We couldn't not mention that. Obviously, lots of backward and forward with those tariffs. Still some uncertainties, and speaking to companies throughout the year, I think that is the word that has been, shouted from the rooftop when it comes to tariffs is uncertainty. I think hopefully by August we should get some more clarity on that. Again, another recent update. So it's been a lot going on in the US, but I think hopefully there will be some light at the end of the tunnel, and companies will start to know where their businesses fit within the policies that are being made and that are being solidified right now.
Sure, and those tariffs even now still constantly changing, aren't they? We can't put figures on it now because by tomorrow they could well have changed again by the time this goes out.
They could, and it's interesting. I think there's a story that's in our top 5, possibly our top 3 for the year at Gasworld so far, concerns Trump and a US-Japan energy deal. So we wouldn't necessarily have seen that one trending so high. Molly's absolutely right in terms of the touch points for our users. Definitely interested in the US content and the Europe content, as we might expect. Also a lot around hydrogen. So there's clearly a thirst for knowledge and market information, and in some respects, the bad news as well as the good.
Certainly is. And on the note of news, Christian, I'm going to come back to you. We've had a whistle-stop tour there of some of the big stories from the first half of the year, but from your global point of view, what are some of the other big stories from the last 6 months?
I mean, there's been a lot going across. I mean, one of the things about the industrial gas sector is that it covers a lot of different markets. If I just give a rundown of some of the dynamics we've got in helium, we've had a kind of continuation of some of the dynamics that were brought into play when Russia started producing lots of helium about 18 months ago now, a bit more than that. So that's changed the shape of the global helium market by increasing supply, taking us out of that situation where we had a shortage, and changing some of the global dynamics, changing the position of China, which is buying a lot of the Russian helium at the moment, enabling China to do things that perhaps it wasn't able to do before, putting pressure on some of the majors that have been supplying Asia and are now finding less of a ready market there at a price they want to sell at. So we've ended up with a slightly more regional helium market than we had, with different pricing in different areas. There's still a lot of need for new supply. While we have a bigger source of overall supply, we still have relatively few supply sources for helium globally. So there are still lots of speculative projects going on trying to boost helium supply. Lots of companies in the US that are still ploughing ahead with trying to ramp up helium supply or get into the market for the first time. So, it's fairly steady in the dynamic shifted a while ago, but what we're seeing is a continuation of that. and we're tracking to see whether the price of helium in different markets means that it's still viable for companies that want to continue to invest. The message so far seems to be that it is. We aren't seeing many companies fall by the wayside. There have been one or two instances of companies having to refinance or shoring up their financing, or companies coming together, but in the grand scheme of things, helium wise, there's still lots of appetite to press ahead with bringing new helium supply to market. So that's one side of things. We've talked a little bit about CO2. We can return to that in some detail, but we've had an interesting time in relation to direct air capture of CO2. This is the holy grail in some respects in terms of achieving net zero by 2050, having to pull CO2 out of the air at huge volumes, and the need for the price of the technology to do that having to come down quite steeply. There's lots of players in that marketplace, over 100, and still a lot of confidence that DAC can work. But in some ways this feels like a crunch year or two really for DAC to kind of prove on some of the promises that were made a year or two ago. There's a lot of interest now from the industry about merchant CO2 supply and where DAC might fit, but it's all dependent upon the price of CO2 from direct air capture falling and the volumes starting to come through. So there's lots of projects that are just getting going. So I do think that's a very interesting and crucial juncture we're reaching now, I would say, over the next 12 months to see where DAC starts to go, and if it can realise some of the promise that obviously always gets talked up by companies that are in that space, or whether it comes up a bit short. So there's lots going on there. It's one to watch. If we turn to other markets, air gases, one of the core markets for the industrial gas market generally. We looked in our air gases issue for GasWorld Global at some of the dynamics there. And one of the interesting things that has come through with air gases has been the rise of smaller air gas projects. Many more small ASU projects now coming to market than there used to be. So it used to be done at scale, but the economics of delivering quite small ASU projects really stack up now, and they can be turned around very quickly. And that has actually shifted the market quite considerably, in that you've got even just say one industrial major, some of them on their own each year are doing maybe 50 ASU projects at a relatively small scale. That's a different dynamic. The numbers have been building over the last few years, but they are higher than ever. So I think that's a very fascinating thing, with the ASUs and air gases generally sitting at the heart of industrial gases. The dynamics in that space are continuing to shift. There's so much else to go at, but I won't hog all of the time that we have. I'll leave it there for now, and we can return to some other things later on.
Thanks for that, Christian. Yeah, certainly been a busy year, hasn't it, in terms of helium.
Some interesting points there, yeah. And we do see air gases trending, which it doesn't tend to. We see that trending in our engaged articles online. And then I agree, it's a critical couple of years for DAC. I'm starting to see a lot more pushback from within the industry saying, we're done with all this talk of green CO2 and DAC and capturing it. It's not going anywhere. It never will. So it'll be interesting to see if those doubters can be proven wrong. Yeah,
and how that will all play out over the next 6 months. Perhaps when we'll be talking here later this year, Christian, it'll either be up or down, but we'll have an answer either way. Charlie, I'll bring you back in here. I know you have a lot to say on the hydrogen front. There's been a lot of
Charlie,
the Charlie that you know. Yeah, there's been a lot of good news, probably more bad news. So I'll let you take up some of the big stories coming out of H2V and the hydrogen industry.
Well, it's kind of my job to have something to say, isn't it, Rob? I suppose, maybe let's jump back to the whole air products thing, because I do wonder whether this is a sign of something bigger and a bigger question that we all need to be asking ourselves. And that is really of what the industrial gas major should be doing in hydrogen. What is their role going to be? Because the whole reason we've seen this reset from them is because a lot of investors weren't happy. They're putting a lot of capital on the line, going after projects that kind of stepped away from the traditional IG model. And then we have this leadership change, step back from a lot of them, and even Neon, which was positioned as the poster child for green hydrogen. Eduardo came in and said, yeah, I had a lot of concerns about the project, but the economics of it are quite good once it's up and running. The issue is the plant's starting up next year and they haven't got a buyer until 2030. So from there, they're going to be selling ammonia direct. People will just come in with a ship, board it on, and that's not their problem anymore. It's not a plan for Air Products to get into ammonia. They've been quite explicit about that. It is just to try and cover their losses here. But I suppose my question is, is clean hydrogen, or green hydrogen specifically, as it's positioned as this grid balancing tool, as a fuel for the future, are those the markets that industrial gas companies and their investors are willing to get into, where it's regulated, price sensitive, policy driven, whereas the industrial gas market, you're on take or pay contracts. It's very secure, it's steady. And I think we're already seeing that. It's less noticeable across some of the other tier ones because perhaps they had a bit of a different approach. Linde has been quite clear. We're primarily doing blue hydrogen on a large scale on take or pay contracts. Air Liquide, the project it's delivering, is in a joint venture with Siemens Energy, installing electrolyzers in traditional use cases on a take or pay basis where there is no risk for the client because they already have an SMR there. If the electrolyzer breaks down, they can just turn the SMR back up. So I'm just starting to wonder, although we're starting to see a bit of traction in refining ammonia as the kind of early use cases that are going to drive some of the scale, those things on the periphery that got our investors really excited all those years ago, is it really going to be the industrial gas companies that take those forward? I don't know. Maybe some of you guys have some thoughts on it, but it's been nibbling away at me, I think.
I think it's a great question, Charlie. You are here to talk about hydrogen and you are here to ask those questions. It is a good question. I think it's been asked. I think you're starting to answer it, in fact, aren't you? And you're right, Air Products did give us a bit of an answer to that, I would say. I think the industry has been a bit confused about its role, how what role it plays in this, because it's probably aware that due to the regulatory landscape, like you said, it can't own it, it can't fully control it. It knows it has this sort of moral obligation and a clear business case to be there, but yeah, it feels like everybody's stood on that precipice and they're slowly retreating, or not so slowly in Air Products' case now with $3.1 billion of project write-downs. I think it's confused the industry. I think it's a little bit cautious and a little bit caught in the headlights.
I'd put back to you, Charlie, if that is the case here, if no one is willing to make that jump, where does that leave the hydrogen industry right now here as we record in July 2025? Where do we go?
It's $1 million question, isn't it? I think, look, I'm not trying to say industrial gas players aren't going to have a role to play in hydrogen. They're the ones who have dealt with this gas for decades and decades. They have the technical ability. It's just whether their business model will allow it and how risk averse they are. I think that's really the key here. Interestingly, we're starting to see some of the pure play green hydrogen players adopting a bit of an industrial gas business model for green hydrogen. Just a few weeks ago, ITM Power, the UK electrolyser maker, launched a new subsidiary, and their plan is to build small-scale electrolyser plants on site for a customer and sell them hydrogen. Sound familiar? Yeah, it's, this is the way that it's been done for years and years and years. So maybe that's a way of unlocking. I think there's definitely a broader realization that it has to be those big, large, or the kind of traditional hydrogen use cases that move first and are really going to push things at scale. So I wonder whether it's not so much about industrial gas players' role then, it's what this market is going to form to look like. Are we going to see those kind of more niche, exciting use cases come through anytime soon? there's a lot of question marks over it. But I think, as I say, those 100, 200 megawatts at a refinery or ammonia plant, that's where action's going to happen. Slower than we want, but it will happen.
But you are right, Charlie, in that if it's the industry, typically, if it isn't in their wheelhouse, as they like to say, if the business model isn't in their wheelhouse, then they are more averse to that.
I suppose I just feel there's a mismatch in a way between the sort of grand narratives that are attached to achieving net zero. So the green hydrogen was obviously fundamental to that kind of big ticket vision, which the politicians have to kind of come up with under pressure. So you have that kind of that sweeping narrative there, and then you have the kind of the reality on the ground of trying to do things. And there's been this, continued divergence. I suppose the hope is that the two things will kind of intersect and somehow meet each other. But essentially they haven't. So you haven't got these huge use cases. You haven't got the infrastructure in place, so you can't do things. So you're left doing things as things have always been done, trying to get things away on a case-by-case basis at a scale that works, where the economics work. It might be more expensive, but there are lots of different variables that companies figure into the mix to see whether it works for them when they're looking at things long term. And we can all find really interesting use cases where green hydrogen works, and we will continue to find them. But the point is that the vision was to do things at such a huge scale, in such a grand manner, and the reality is so much more like typical day-to-day business that the two have never kind of have met each other. And I guess there was no evidence up front that they ever would, because that's quite a big ask for an unproven technology to kind of make that leap. And sadly, so far it hasn't happened.
So, Charlie, what then of the Hydrogen Council? What does that organisation have to say at the moment? Because let's face it, the industrial gases companies were founders of that. I mean, Air Liquide certainly. They're very prominent players. They know the molecule like anybody else. We're talking about it being unproven, or certainly in its green hydrogen technology pathway, but they know about it more than anybody else. What does the Hydrogen Council say in this whole era? And I know the narrative has shifted to low carbon hydrogen, but where are we at?
Yeah, I mean, I sat down with Ivana, the CEO of the Hydrogen Council, in May at the World Hydrogen Summit, and in danger of parroting a lot of what has kind of come out of that council trip. But I believe a group of them had just returned from China, where they completely appeared in disbelief at the scale and the speed that things are happening. We're talking about walking into factories and the lights having to be turned on to see what's actually happening. It's that level of automation. When we say hydrogen isn't happening, or it's really struggling in the West. China has the most installed electrolyser capacity. They have the most electrolyser manufacturing capacity. And anecdotally, from speaking with people, more and more projects are coming round to the idea of using Chinese-made equipment. And that's because they have got on and they've done it. They've installed electrolysers at a massive capacity and are kind of proving it out. They're going through these challenges of, okay, it doesn't work in this operating profile, and really narrowing those things down. So they actually have a product that's ready for market. Whereas I think this tentative approach from some of the Western players, yes, you've installed plenty of 1 megawatt systems, but have you done 200 megawatts? It's a different ball game. So I guess that was the message from the council when I spoke with them, is that Europe has a job on its hands here to try and really take its portion of this market. And I wonder that there has been a notable shift in tone, I think, mainly down to the politics of this. Previously, it was energy security, cleaning up. Now it's all about industrial competitiveness and not giving everything up to China. The kind of message I got given by Ivana was China is doing this on the basis of industrial domination. The climate benefits, they're a happy side effect, essentially. Europe needs to find how it will develop its own flavour of that. How is it going to stamp its mark on this industry and then reap all the benefits down the line? And then I suppose that kind of ties into the question of the near-term pragmatism or looking to do things right from day one when we're talking about rules for producing green and blue hydrogen. Are they too strict right now? A huge amount of people think so. So yeah, I suppose that's the message, is we perhaps need a more pragmatic approach.
So is it all about that enabling environment then, Charlie? Because you would think with those companies we've talked about, the technologies, we've got all the prowess and capability and might here to be able to do that, haven't we? If it was a case of going toe-to-toe with China, so to speak, surely the West has got the capability to do that.
Well, do we? Because as we've seen over the last few years, the EV market, it's primarily in China, beyond a couple of key players. Solar industry in Europe, decimated, it's all in China. And that's the real fear here, is that these technologies that have been developed with billions of public funds in Europe are going to be lost to China. But equally, I suppose there's the question of, as a taxpayer, what are you going to be happier with? Are you going to be happier with your government giving more subsidies to a local player because that equipment was made here? Or are you happier giving the same amount of money to a Chinese company and getting a lot more for it in terms of capacity? So yeah, it feels like policymakers are treading a real tightrope at the moment. Because there is a huge amount of, this is getting quite philosophical now, I suppose, but there are so many other priorities going on with war in Europe, people really not feeling the benefits of these heavy investments yet. So they need to keep trying to tell this story in a way that is actually going to benefit real people and not just industries that we currently have.
Yeah, there has for some time been a feeling that conflict in 2022 derailed a lot of the momentum in those hydrogen circles. Not to veer away from the hydrogen too much, Charlie, but one company that's been active in the news recently that's very much in hydrogen and all of the clean energy fuels is Chart, isn't it?
Yes, and there's been some big news come out of Chart fairly recently. I think, Molly, you're probably the best positioned to bring us this story and everything that's going on there.
Yeah, of course. So it was announced last month that Chart's to merge with industrial machinery company Flowserve. It was huge news and probably quite unexpected. Chart's been a company that's made a fair few acquisitions recently, notably that really large one of Howden. So to get this through, it was quite a shock to everyone. Chart will be the majority shareholder moving forward. It looks like, the merger's going to result in a new company name, which is to be announced later this year. The company will be based in Houston. A lot of changes there. One of the really huge changes for Chart as well is that Jill Evanko will step back from her president and CEO role. A role that she's held for a very long time now, and Jill's become a figurehead in the industry. So it's interesting to see her step back from that. She'll still sit on the board of the new company. However, Scott Rowe, who was CEO of Flowserve, will be taking that top spot at the new yet to be named company moving forward. There's a lot of interesting things that is set to come out of that. As we reported, there's lots of digital technology advances that can be had between the two companies, kind of advancing Flowserve's existing tech with some of Chart's elements and vice versa too. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. And I think everyone's waiting for those next steps to be confirmed, seeing what the company's name will be, how it will sit. But yeah, it's a really big story to come out of the US, and I feel like everyone's in that sit and wait moment now to see how that will pan out.
Yeah, and that's a story we'll be keeping our eyes on at GasWorld, on gasworld.com, and any fresh news out about that'll all be there, won't it?
It will. You'd expect them to go to ground for a few months, I think, while they work through the complexities of that merger and streamlining, but we'll be plugging away there, won't we?
We certainly will. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've covered a lot of US news, covered a lot of hydrogen, but I guess, Christian, I'll come back to you first on this. What else should we be keeping our eyes on heading into the second half of the year?
I mean, we've touched on a lot of different areas. There were still, there's still things to say about hydrogen. One of the things I was thinking about earlier on is the number of hydrogen projects that are being announced in India at the moment, which is absolutely striking. And there's probably far more coming out of India than it feels like everywhere else combined in terms of the scale of them and the nature of some of those projects. So, presumably a lot of that is being supplied by China, as a near neighbour, but they'll have various suppliers in the frame. But it's just interesting to note that there are these, when we talk about the sort of tectonic plates in the sort of global hydrogen market, there's a lot of different moving parts, while simultaneously there's been all this uncertainty in the US, which won't have done it any favours. The whole question of whether the West gets left behind is hardly helped by what's happened in the US. But in the meantime, countries like India and China march ahead. So I thought I'd just throw that in the mix because it's striking when you see the flow of news, how many big projects are coming out of India across all sorts of industries, different applications, different stories, trains running on hydrogen, different industrial facilities that can use hydrogen as a replacement for whatever was being used. So that kind of stuff's very significant. When we look at, one of the things we haven't touched on, it's a big area, but cryogenic gases and some of the work that has been going on in cryogenics, some of the opportunities there. When we were shining a light on that for our recent issue, a few things came to light. One of the opportunities in cryogenic gases is around the growth of the space industry and the space sector, which is growing hugely quickly and is a massive user of cryogenic gases and in need of some big technology developments really to kind of to push that forward. But commercial space is a massive new market, or an established market that's growing dramatically quickly and with growth prospects that stretch into the decades ahead. So that's really one to watch. Huge amount of cryogenic gases needed there. Lots of different technology developments that will enable the next phase of the space industry. And obviously the whole world runs on data these days, and that's all enabled by satellites. And never mind missions to Mars and stuff like that. Just the basics of keeping us all connected demands endless satellites going up to ensure that everything runs as smooth as it can back on Earth. So that kind of stuff's going on. One of the interesting interviews I did for that same cryogenic issue was with a company called Highview Power, which has an interesting technology taking liquid air and compressing it and using it as a kind of battery essentially to supply energy to balance energy grids. And I suppose one of the other big stories that taps into is the way that industrial gases intersects with energy grid demands at the moment. It intersects through a company like Highview Power, and the fact it's got these new plants is going to build out over the next few years, and the idea is that those plants will be able to replace natural gas run plants, which are the way that you balance the grid at the moment, because they can be turned on and off very quickly and they can generate electricity very quickly. The idea is that a cryogenic gas technology like Highview's will replace that and be carbon neutral, whereas obviously gas-fired power stations aren't. But energy is crucial to the production of air gases. The energy that's required, the greening of the energy that's required to supply air gases is on the agenda of all the industrial gas majors at the moment. One of the challenges the industry faces is that there's a kind of war on to capture energy at the moment, green energy in particular, and basically the companies with the deepest pockets are in big tech. The Googles and Apples, Amazons of this world are all building data centers at high speed. They all need energy to supply those data centers. Ideally, they need green energy to power those data centers, and they're the ones that are enabling, a massive build out of the electricity grid. Powered by renewables, that's all fine, but other industries, including industrial gases, need to be in that space and making their mark. They've all got their own commitments that they need to fit when it comes to ESG, environmental social governance commitments, net zero commitments. So it's a very complex space, and it goes right to the heart of how we kind of manage our world, power the planet, keep everything moving. And there's a competition element to it that is quite hard if you're not big tech, because they have the deepest pockets and are making things happen on their terms. So it's about finding your place within that. And industrial gases may have opportunities in that space with the likes of high view power, but it's also a big challenge if you're going to run all your ASUs on renewables, which is the aspiration, in a relatively short time frame. You need to find a way to do that somehow circumvents or competes with big tech. That's not an easy thing to do.
Sure. And Molly, is there anything you think we should be keeping our eyes on heading into next year? I'm thinking CO2 here. We're heading towards our North American CO2 summit in Denver in just a few months' time.
It's that time of year again.
We start to see those plant closures. We start to see, hurricane season that can have a impact. So
allocations,
yeah. Is there anything that we should be keeping our eyes on there?
Yeah, no, certainly. As you both said, it's that time of year, that summer season where perhaps, companies are starting to see that tightening in supply. In the US, California seems to be the kind of state that feels it first. We've seen year on year the same plants shut down for maintenance, but there are still those struggles. Year after year at our CO2 summits, people are speaking about diversifying supply, have multiple sources. And we've had tightening in the past few years, so it'll be interesting to see, the state of play this summer, whether any lessons have been learned, if we're still going to get that tightening. As of yet, we haven't heard anything, but I don't want to jinx that. So I think that is a really important thing to keep an eye on. It's something that people sadly almost anticipate, and you can never be too prepared for that. Obviously, with the policy that I mentioned earlier, the 45Q, that indicates a really positive sign for the CO2 industry in the US. I think that will be a big talking point throughout the rest of the year, and hopefully, while people want to hit those net zero targets with storing CO2, it's so important to keep that merchant market running. As everyone knows, the crucial applications for CO2 in food and beverage, medical. So it's important that, the market finds that right balance. And hopefully now that tax credit is pushed through, maybe the summers will be slightly better when it comes to tight supplies. Hopefully not as many people will be sequestering that CO2 and some will be putting it back into the market. That's something to really keep an eye on. And in Europe too, it's not just a US thing, these CO2 shortages. Sadly, Europe's hit by them every year as well. So it's certainly the time of year where we're maybe hear whispers of short supply, and that's something that we'll keep our readers updated on.
And something that we'll be covering in Denver in September in a few months' time.
Molly's right. We are hearing some of those whispers, and we're trying to delve into that.
We certainly are. And Charlie, just to get your crystal ball out now, as we head into the second half of the year, what can we expect to see from the hydrogen point of view?
I think in Europe we're going to see a bit more debate about the low carbon delegated acts, which are essentially the rules for any type of clean hydrogen that isn't green. They were adopted by the Commission today, and the Council and Parliament are due to be debating on them. And it seems like they've landed in a place where they've tried to be balanced to both camps, and are pleasing no one. A lot of the industry is saying that they're still too stringent and they're going to make it really difficult and expensive to build these projects, while the kind of environmental groups are saying it could quite seriously undermine the climate positive that low carbon hydrogen could have. So that's going to be interesting to watch. If the last couple of months are anything to go by, I think we can expect to see more warning signs from some electrolyzer players and other technology players. We've had two bankrupted and acquired in some capacity in the past couple of months, and I think that is going to be a trend that we're going to continue to see for a little bit longer. And I think more broadly, we're probably going to see a bit of a focus on this concept of lead markets, where I think the industry really wants policymakers to make it quite clear where they want this molecule being used in the near term, and put some mandates and support and some real support in place for them. So yeah, I suppose those are my big three for the next couple of months.
Great, thank you for that, Charlie. As you say, we do still have a busy year ahead. So as we start to wrap up this conversation, we've touched on conferences ahead. We should also say we've got the awards later this year. I think we touched on that in our previous podcast, didn't we?
GWGI Awards, yeah.
We've also got webinars, more podcasts, but the three of you also have 5 more editions of Glassworld Global, US and H2View coming up. So what can we expect to see and look forward to in those next few editions? Molly, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, sure. So, I think we've got 3 big editions in the final quarter of this year coming up that really captivate everything that we've spoken about today. We have our helium issue, our clean fuel issues, and our CO2 issue. Each of those topics has been explained in some depth already on this episode. So I think it's really interesting to have those in the latter part of the year, because we really get to summarize everything that has been going on. Obviously, the helium issue ties in really nicely with the Helium Summit in Austin, which again, we'll be speaking about those new suppliers, as Christian said about earlier, and perhaps some of the companies that have been struggling. Earlier this year, Royal Helium filed for bankruptcy, for example. That's now been acquired and they're trying to get back up and running. So hopefully these are some stories that we'll get some clarity on later this year, and hopefully we'll be able to speak about those in our helium issue. Obviously, Charlie's spoken at depth about hydrogen and clean fuels. Again, hopefully we'll get some updates on some of those key projects in the US. He mentioned hydrogen hubs, whether we'll know more about funding for those. And then CO2, again, another huge topic that we've spoken about today. Hopefully captivating some of the conversations that will undoubtedly happen at Denver about supply. If there is any shortages this year, hopefully we'll be able to pull those apart and kind of see what went wrong. But hopefully we don't see those issues. But 3 really big additions coming up, and I think they're 3 major topics that we've not just discussed today, but we've seen time and time again this year crop up. So really excited to dive into those and see what stories emerge.
Yeah, a lot to look forward to in Gasworld US, isn't there? And Charlie, how about with H2View over the next 6 months? What have we got to look forward to?
Oh, I suppose I can be a bit promotional now because it's all changed, isn't it? As most of you would have been able to tell from my kind of incoherent ramblings, there's so much going on in hydrogen. Things are changing so quickly. We've shifted up our format a little bit, so we're going to be really developing our magazines on a news-led basis, still diving into the kind of real key topics. So yeah, expect to kind of see a lot of the latest developments. Next couple of issues, we're going to have a bit of a focus on industrial applications, so chemicals, green steel, and then we will be getting into the electrolyzer debate, which, as I said, this year has been very interesting. So yeah, a good couple of issues coming up next, I hope.
Thanks, Charlie. And finally, Christian, with Gasworld Global.
We've got a lot of, in the second half, at the moment I'm working on a hydrogen and CCUS issue, which obviously overlaps in part with what we've been talking about today, but hugely important markets around blue hydrogen and carbon capture and utilisation that we're working on at the moment. There's a big overlap with the whole kind of decarbonisation agenda and the energy agenda. We have an issue looking at LNG and all of the LNG markets and how they work. We have the end of the year, a decarbonisation themed issue, which can obviously go in many different directions since that's such a broad church. So lots of fascinating overlap there. The energy debate and the whole and energy markets to the fore in some of those. We also have an issue where we just try to take stock of technology developments. We're in this space now where a huge amount is happening all the time, very dynamic markets. You know, industrial gases used to be probably more predictable, but there's more happening than ever, more innovation happening ever, more imperative things to happen more quickly than ever. So our technology issue is an attempt to kind of do justice to some of the tech moves that are shaping the industry going forward. So yeah, huge amount to look forward to in the remainder of the year.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Christian. Thanks to all of you. And we're going to have another catch up in, 6 months' time to wrap up the year, aren't we?
I think we'll have to play it back as well and re-listen to all of that, Tom.
I think we will. But with that, I'll let the three of you get back on with your day, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic to be joined by Charlie, Molly and Christian there, wasn't there? Plenty to think about, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Finger on the pulse from all three of them, of course. It's almost a case of what they don't know in terms of what's going on in these industries isn't worth knowing. But yeah, I made lots of notes. I mean, space, one of our favourite topics, came up there, Tom, didn't it?
One of our favourite topics, and one that, depending on when listeners are listening to this, of course, we're going to be delving into that on a GasWorld webinar on 11th of July this week. So if you're listening to that before, then gasworld.tv, watch that live. If not, watch it on demand. It will still be there waiting for you. So that'd be worth tuning into, isn't it?
It will be, and if they still miss it, then I'm sure we could bring some highlights. Maybe it would give us an excuse to do another space episode, Tom, wouldn't it?
Any excuse.
Absolutely. Also heard about cryogenics. Did you know 2 of our most popular white papers at GasWorld this year have been cryogenics focused?
Interesting.
Yeah, cryogenic vaporizers and cryogenic handling. So I thought that was quite interesting that Christian talked about the cryo side of the business. India as well, of course, another interesting one. Did you also know, Tom? These aren't 1895 facts, of course, but our most popular story on the GasWorld website in the whole of 2024, Inox Air Products. Some plants in India for large-scale green ammonia projects. So, yeah, absolutely on the money. There's loads going on in India. Very popular, a lot of interest in that.
And we've been saying we need to do these regional specials, these regional deep dives on the 1895 podcast. So
there's a good starting point.
There we go. India is going to be one of them, isn't it?
That will certainly be one of them. But yeah, so many things to pick over there. I think it's quite interesting. We've got this sort of a watching brief with helium and CO2. We talked so much about them. We've written so much about them. It felt like they were constantly in shortage, and yet things are relatively calm at the moment. We heard there from Molly and Christian, I think, that things are calm. It's relatively hunky-dory in those two supply chains, but you just never know.
And these things can happen very quickly.
Black swan events.
As we've seen previously, black swan events. We were very close to one in recent weeks or recent months. So who knows what's around the corner?
Yeah, absolutely. And then with CO2, we got that whole talking point around DAC and capture and the critical kind of inflection point or juncture, as Christian said, in terms of proving those technologies. And not so much proving the technology, but proving the economics and the business case. We heard all about that in Rotterdam a few months ago as well, didn't we? Getting under the hood or under the bonnet of those business cases and finding what really does work.
We did, and we've spent a few episodes on DAC as well over the last year and a bit. We spoke to Climeworks just last year, and then we of course had that DAC panel which we brought to our podcast listeners from our event in Rotterdam earlier this year. So
go back and listen, and
that's going to have to be a topic that we revisit again in the future, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's all constantly evolving. And
of course we've had the health check in hydrogen from Charlie there, so always good value, isn't he?
Always good value, and I feel like we could have had him on the line there for another 2 hours and he still wouldn't have said everything.
We'd have only just got out of the US, wouldn't we?
We certainly would have. But I think that's enough from us today, isn't it?
It is indeed, yeah.
Got plenty of episodes in the works, working behind the scenes with some interviews coming up. All
the things we didn't talk about today.
All the things we didn't talk about. So we've got an episode on medical oxygen, which we're going to release in the next few weeks.
Yeah.
One of these regional specials, I'd like to delve into Canada, if I could.
Topical there.
A lot of news coming out of there. And also slightly relevant to our specialty gas event and the episode we released last week.
The big one we didn't talk about today.
It's PFAS.
Yes, absolutely. And we talked about that PFAS risk watch report in the last episode, I think.
Yeah, we touched on that, and that can, of course, be downloaded at gasworld.com, so we should urge listeners to go and download that. But we're going to dedicate a whole episode to PFAS as well, aren't we? But in the meantime, do please like, follow, and share the 1895 podcast, and we'll be back again next week.